Supervisor Gibson?
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you. As this is the third time we've talked about this, and again, I think it's unusual to the point of possibly unprecedented. The board has been as detailed as it is, and I'm going to argue for some direction going forward that's more general and of the policy nature, so we can get this into the hands of our Planning Commission, where rightfully these details are going to be hashed out. Couple of questions. When exactly does the urgency ordinance expire?
September 19th.
Of this year?
Yes, that's correct. It can be extended up to one additional year.
Yeah, that's what I guess I should have asked it that way. So potentially September 19th of 2018. And I wonder if council might opine whether the urgency ordinance might be a way of handling the coastal zone during the time that the Coastal Commission, if we pass an inland ordinance, can we declare that the urgency ordinance doesn't apply in that area inland and simply let it continue in the coastal zone?
I think so. Yes, I'm Tim McNulty with the County Counsel's Office.
Something to think about, but that may be a reasonable way to approach that. Second, in just reading over, I didn't see, is growing banned in all of the Carrizo planning area, or is it in residential suburban zoning? I didn't see the planning area. Right?
In this June draft, it's just residential suburban.
Thank you. So I'll put a couple of thoughts out here, if I might, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I don't think we should let CEQA drive the policy side of this ordinance. This is a comment I've made before. I think that understand that in an effort to be perhaps speedy, staff was trying to use a baseline approach off the urgency ordinance and see what we could permit that could be squeezed into the point of an exemption. I think we need to take advantage of the exemption that Mr. McNulty has listed for us in the trailer bill. And I didn't catch whether the significance of the trailer bill was actually explained to those who don't know. This is a reconciliation of rules that were coming under the medical side and the recreational side under Prop 64, so that there'll be a single state level framework of regulation. So I think that's important. So my thought is that we need to look at what makes sense in terms of regulating cannabis in this county. And I'm really, I'll be honest, I'm not really interested in going through and debating the specifics of setbacks or too much of the details of the specifics of this ordinance. But I have I got one other question, and then I've got three other policy points that I'd like to point out. My other question is, do we have a clear statement of the status of industrial hemp here? It's my understanding now that under California, Department of Food and Agriculture regulations, industrial hemp can be regulated and considered under as simply as crop production. Is that planning staff's understanding based on what we have before us in cannabis regulation?
That's correct. And the definition of cannabis in both the ordinances, page 9 of Title 22, the definition of cannabis does not include industrial hemp. Right. So industrial hemp would not have to follow these standards. And
I think that's important. That's one of the principles, and make sure that gets clear as we move through the planning process. Is industrial hemp has got a separate issue. It's now got state regs, and it should go forward under crop production like any
Mr. Chair, if I could speak to that. It is correct to state that the draft version that we've come up with excludes industrial hemp from the definition of cannabis, as does the trailer bill. The question of whether or not the production of industrial hemp is something that we would consider crop production under Title 22 that doesn't require any sort of land use authority is something that we haven't had to address yet. There is a provision where someone who questions whether or not an activity is consistent with what's allowed by Title 22 can ask to have that determination made by the Planning Commission. I presume that if we wanted to, we could go through that process and have that decision made there. I just don't want anyone to leave the meeting today thinking that the board's already decided that industrial hemp is something that doesn't require any sort of land use regulation from the county.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, I would modify that slightly and suggest that we direct staff to address that question as part of the planning process.
Yeah, for sure.
So that we get a clear statement along the lines of the intent that I have. So the other three, the other three policy level things that I think are important to pass on to the Planning Commission and let them get to work on this is, first of all, in crafting these land use regulations, we should be regulating to the actual impacts of the activity that we're talking about. This is a now legal substance to grow, to modify through manufacturing, to distribute in a variety of ways, both medicinally and recreationally. I think if we're going to set some numerical limits, we need to have some evidence in the record. And so I would commend the Planning Commission to really think about what the actual setbacks and other numerical parameters of deciding how things grow. The 300-foot setback seems arbitrary and frankly too big, but I don't want to get into the argument of that. That general policy then also, I think, argues that there should not be a cap on the number of licenses. We're going to craft land use regulations that protects the health, safety, and welfare of the community. And so having done that, I think we are then set up to let the market take care of how many of these. We say where this makes sense to grow, how it makes sense, and I'm talking about the product coming out of the Planning Commission. So I would argue under that broad policy, we wouldn't need numerical. I think we beg for a lot of confusion and conflict and unnecessary work if we try to put an arbitrary cap. Second thing is I don't think we should create land use entitlements that are pertinent or run with the land, and that was a conversation that I had with Ms. Kirk actually yesterday. I think we need to be very humble as we move forward in trying to regulate cannabis. This is brave and uncharted territory, and I think we've got to understand that we will need to come back and modify things as we go forward in the future. And to create a permanent entitlement to do a certain thing gets us in trouble. We've seen it on a number of different other facets of our land use regulation. As I look at the proposed ordinance, this extinguishment of the entitlement upon sale or transfer is something that could quite easily be gained, frankly. An LLC could hold a piece of property and we would never know. So that was a conversation, I had with Ms. Kirk, and some time limit should be placed on that, again, to be determined by Planning Commission decisions. And then the third broad policy idea I'd like to put forward to the Planning Commission is I think this county needs to stay close to allowing those activities that state law allows. I think that we, again, get into if we start being significantly more restrictive than the state, I think we add layers of complication. I think we add layers of inequity. I think we do not avoid what might be perceived as impacts lurking out there. So I would, I would say that if we are going to ban some of the activities that are ours to consider, we need to have specific findings of why that should be banned in this county. And I'm not sure that that this county is all that different from the rest of California. And I'm not, that finding is not just that we don't like it. I fully recognize the state doesn't do land use regulations, so we are crafting the specifics. But again, if we try to ban certain activities, I'm convinced we're not going to avoid the impacts of it. And so that speaks to things like recreational dispensaries. Why would we not allow recreational dispensaries here? Why would we not allow volatile manufacturing in the right place? I mean, goodness, we have in our industrial areas, we have very dangerous substances being used all the time. So I'm thinking that under the idea of trying to stay close to what the state allows, items like how many licenses on a particular premises get answered there. State allows multiple licenses on a specific parcel. And I think if we craft our land use regulations right, that'll happen. So again, I'm not arguing for any specific changes or specific direction on the details, but under those broad policy directions to the Planning Commission, I think we need to get this moving through their process.
Thank you. Supervisor Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I agree with my colleague on both the approach and the general points that he made, partly because that's why we have the Planning Commission that will allow for a greater look at some of these in a very specific way. But, I've been convinced as we've talked about this and looked at this and met with people throughout the community and others that obviously have an interest from outside the community too, that we should, as we've heard Ms. Kirk and Mr. Keith say, try to treat this as best as we can like any other crop with certain standards that apply to, that are unique to this crop. But generally speaking, even, the environmental issues, the water issues, some of those things that are important concerns are important concerns whether you're growing strawberries or wine grapes or cannabis. And treating it as such, I think, is useful and also practical to do that as well. And, when this first started to come before us, I think, most of my I guess, support for this being legalized in a sense was mostly just my deep moral objection to the war on drugs and the just terrible social disasters that it has created. But I think it's pretty clear, and the public has spoken quite clearly in statewide votes and expressed locally too, that this is a product that people don't want to be making a crime in the way that we have, and so we have, as we do with the wine industry, a kind of model. There are many people that object to cannabis for reasons that I think are very similar to the reasons people would object and have objected to anything to do with alcohol too. And certainly I respect that, but that's, again, looking at what Mr. Gibson said, that has nothing to do with getting an ordinance that makes sense and is fair to as many people as possible. And that's why, I don't want to see us saying who's going to win and who's going to lose based on arbitrary numbers, caps, and things like that. I think the market is going to decide a lot if we get the regulations right, and that's what people need to trust. And I'm not always the promoter of free market values, but there are certain things that just work best in agriculture, and related products just do work best in a free market. And so if we can do so without there being anything that tilts towards bigger growers versus smaller growers, the market's going to sort that out. Just like it'll sort out whatever it is that the consumer demands, wants, will pay for, et cetera. Those are things, that we're not ultimately going to be deciding on. I think that we have an ability to get this right as a way to also be responsible to the real concerns that our law enforcement and others have expressed at times, which is if we get it right, it should make it easier for our code enforcement and our law enforcement to do what they need to do to punish people who are not complying. And I don't think anybody who's going to spend the money to comply with regulations and be a legitimate member of the community in this business wants to see people who are trying to make a buck on the cheap either. So I think, most people would agree that getting these things right will help. And as we've said before, there's always going to be, because it's new, there's always going to be some issues that we might have to address. And if they are code enforcement, law enforcement related, we will provide the resources to get through that. But I've been here long enough to see the wine industry go from, like a handful of local ones to this enormous industry now that sometimes is so big it scares people. So I get that, but we've also been able to deal with a lot of the problems and figure out a way to not over-regulate as to inhibit the economic growth of industries.